Awesome. Okay, well, welcome to our presentation today on LGBTQ philanthropy. We're very happy that you're here. I have a couple of little reminders, I guess, and welcomes. So my name is Dr. Alicia Shadaman. I'm the director of the Center for Nonprofit and NGO Studies here at Northern Illinois. Just as a reminder, the session is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel, and you'll see other presentations that we've done will be there as well. For right now, our mics are muted, and we may unmute them as we go, but we'll see. Right now, they're all muted just so we don't get any background noise. You can use the chat to send any questions. That is open, actually. We decided to keep that open because Elizabeth wanted to make it as interactive as possible. So we will be taking questions throughout as well as at the end. I want to remind folks, if you have not been to one of our programs before, we do a number of different programs throughout the year. Coming up next week, Dr. Mark Schuler, who's also at NIU in the Center in Anthropology, he's doing a presentation on his latest book, Humanity's Last Stand. And then a presentation in March, we have Dr. Diane Rogers, who's in our sociology department, Children in Social Movements. So we do these speaker series where we bring in academics and talk about their research or their latest publications. We also do moderated discussions, and these are kind of what we've coined real talk, big ideas on a big topic. No presentations, no PowerPoints, nothing. It's a discussion with an academic and a practitioner. Our next one coming up is nonprofit financial health. Then we'll be doing advocacy and social innovation. You can sign up for all of those. Either you'll find those on our website or on the Eventbrite listing. And then we do some workshops for nonprofit folks. Two that are coming up is use of data for grant proposals, and another one, developing your organization's values, vision, and mission. So I want to thank our partners for today, the Gender and Sexuality Resource Center, and you'll be hearing more from Molly as we go along in our presentation. Also the Center for the Study of Women, Gender, and Sexuality. And kudos to them, they have a new bachelor's degree major in that program this fall or last fall. And then the Presidential Commission on Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity. So thank you all for your partnership in this presentation. And today's presentation, while you're all here, LGBTQ philanthropy with Dr. Elizabeth Dale. She is an assistant professor in the nonprofit leadership program at Seattle University. And we all noted her mountains in the background here coming from the prairies. You notice anything, any elevation kind of whatsoever. She's done a lot of research in this area as well as women's and all the issues around gender and philanthropy. So I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. There we go. And Elizabeth, it is all yours.
Thank you so much, Alicia, and thank you for joining me here today, learning a little bit more about my research and a topic that's been really important to me throughout my career, both as a fundraiser and an academic. Everything sound good with the audio? All right. So I'm so glad you could join us today. Like Alicia said, I'll use the chat a couple times just to keep us engaged and because I want to hear from you. And then we'll have plenty of time today for questions and discussion. So I only plan to present for about 45 minutes and then want to make sure that we have at least a half hour for questions and discussion. As you all know, our topic today is understanding and cultivating LGBTQ donors. A little bit by way of my background. So I started as a fundraiser in Chicago, working both for the YWCA Metropolitan Chicago and then a community medical center. So I have some Chicago roots from long ago. And it was there that both from my own personal experience as a lesbian and working in the Boys Town neighborhood of Chicago, which is where the hospital was that I was a fundraiser for, started to work with LGBTQ donors. And the question of whether the LGBTQ community participated differently in philanthropy was something that was sort of always raised and never answered. And so I started some research back in 2015, actually looking specifically at this community. And since then, we've actually had a couple of other scholars join me in this endeavor, and we've slowly grown the research in this area. So I'm excited to share it with you today. I'm also going to share some research that was done more from a fundraising consulting perspective. It's called the LGBTQ Giving Project. And this was actually work that my wife, who's a fundraising consultant with Campbell and Company, led. And so sometimes we present this together as sort of a dynamic duo on LGBTQ philanthropy. But we've allowed one another to kind of borrow from each other's research, and I will share some of that as well. Hers is really great because she's actually been able to work directly with a number of LGBTQ organizations and see some of what I've studied kind of put into practice. All right, so let's get started here. Just a quick agenda for the day. I'm going to start broadly talking about the philanthropic landscape for the LGBTQ community. Then we'll go into a little bit about donor giving behavior, what's different, what's similar, and then kind of a deeper dive into donor motivations. And I think this is, at least from the research perspective, this is one of the most interesting areas and hopefully should give us lots to talk about in the discussion. And then I want to make sure that you all leave with some sort of practical, maybe tactical steps to think about or take. And so we'll end with a conversation around both identifying and engaging LGBTQ donors and supporters. So I'm just curious, I know Alicia shared or asked where you all were joining from. I'm curious what role you're sort of bringing with you to this presentation today. Are you a fundraiser? Are you a researcher? Are you a student? Are you a donor? And maybe you can just take a moment and chat that out, and we'll just give everyone a few 15, 20 seconds and see what the group looks like here. So this will help me tailor my remarks. So we have some students, some researchers, definitely some researchers at NIU. I saw UIC, fundraisers. Great. So lots of nonprofit staff members, board members. That's terrific. So hopefully there'll be something for everyone in the presentation today. All right. So we'll start a little bit just looking at the philanthropic landscape. And my PhD actually comes from the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy at Indiana University. So I have a PhD in philanthropic studies, which is the only one of its kind in the country. So philanthropy is really important to me. But as many of you know, when you think of a philanthropist, you might actually have the image of maybe an older gentleman in mind. Maybe one of these historic figures from American philanthropy, pictures of men like Rockefeller, Carnegie, Ford, and JP Morgan. But we know today that American philanthropy is really moving beyond this cookie cutter image or this white, male, pale, stale image of who can be a donor and who can make a difference. And while we have this heightened recognition of who comprises philanthropy, who are donors, and we have a much more increasingly vibrant and diverse donor base, we actually don't know as much about donors who are sort of outside of this norm in some way, who maybe identify with a marginalized community, maybe have a different ethnic background, racial background, are gay or lesbian, bisexual, or transgendered, or even single women and women, both single women and married women, but sort of the power of women's philanthropy is something that we've seen grow a lot over the last decade plus. So these are some of the prominent philanthropists of late, including some signers of the Giving Pledge, which is Melinda and Bill Gates's and Warren Buffett's initiative to encourage individuals, often individuals with significant wealth, to give at least half of that wealth to philanthropic or charitable causes. And so even though we see this increased donor diversity and greater visibility for philanthropists of color, women as lead donors, and younger donors, LGBTQ philanthropic research has kind of been a neglected area. So why does donor diversity matter? For all of you fundraisers in the room and board members and nonprofit staff, you probably know why a diverse donor base is important. We want to increase our donor diversity as a way to steward our organizations in communities. And you want to reach a wider range of donors in order to broaden that support. But thinking about donor diversity, thinking specifically about why you might want to spend particular time and attention on what's already a very kind of busy and packed job, is crucial, because you might have to make this case to others in your organization or to board members or leadership. First, you want to develop donor and community-centered approaches to fundraising that really recognize not all donors are the same. And we've heard a lot about donor-centered fundraising in the last 10, 15 years, but that hasn't necessarily meant donor diversity. It's just meant that the donor is often, the donor's experience is very important. And that's been sort of balanced in the recent past, the last year or two, with this approach of community-centered fundraising that actually has said we've gone too far kind of to the donor side. We've catered too much for donors. We need to think about the other constituencies in nonprofits as well, in particular, the community or the beneficiaries of the organization. We also want to understand that individuals are drawn to support organizations from so many different areas. They might have a variety of ways of supporting you that reflect different giving patterns among different types of donors. We also know that donors have different processes for making decisions about where to give, and different philosophies and experiences that really drive those decisions. And oftentimes fundraisers will try to learn more about these factors that go into making a gift decision as they get to know a donor. And finally, being sensitive to donor diversity can help you avoid pitfalls or errors that really could jeopardize a donor relationship. So these are just some of the reasons why it matters. We've also had a huge social, cultural, and political transformation within the LGBTQ community in the US. Never before has there been such widespread social acceptance for LGBTQ individuals. LGBTQ people are increasing as an ever more visible segment of the US population, whereas a generation or two ago, many more people were in the closet. And today, research indicates that almost 4% of Americans openly identify as LGBTQ. We also know that that is much more common among younger people, so millennials and Gen Z. Almost 20%, sometimes I've seen even 25% of individuals in those generations are identifying as LGBTQ. And so this is a rapidly changing kind of community in the US. 2015, of course, was the year that marriage equality rights were supported by the Supreme Court. And contrary to what a lot of Americans think, that was not sort of the end of equality for LGBTQ people. So just last year, there was an important Supreme Court decision that actually held up employment discrimination protections for LGBTQ people under the sort of broad definition of sex in the Civil Rights Act. But there are still aspects of housing, of credit, and other forms of discrimination that are not legally protected. And then there's also this period of retrenchment, of backlash that we see, particularly with trans individuals, and often at the state level and sort of coming out of the Trump administration. There's also the perception, somewhat both accurate and inaccurate, that LGBTQ couples are more likely to be dual income households with no children. And while that is true, while there is a higher percentage of dual income households among same-sex couples as compared to the general population, we also see this kind of influx as more and more same-sex couples as adoption and marriage and other protections have been extended. But despite sort of that outsized factor, we also know that there are many individuals within the LGBTQ community who are vulnerable, who struggle with poverty, with employment issues, and other forms of discrimination. We know that identities are not just one aspect of ourselves, but involve many different aspects of who we are. And so LGBTQ people of color and trans individuals, LGBTQ people with disabilities are often subject to multiple forms of oppression and discrimination, and actually have much lower kind of quality of life outcomes as compared to the general population. So this is a really kind of diverse community. And while we are putting sort of everyone under this one umbrella of LGBTQ, we need to recognize that there's some very different experiences within this community. So all that being said, ultimately, we know that every donor is different. And what I'll share today are some distinctions and considerations for LGBTQ donors based on their research. But we also know that we don't want to overgeneralize. We need to sort of get to know individuals and their own experiences and kind of use these as points of departure and not necessarily sort of a blanket statement. So I'm curious if you go back to the chat here, if you have any either guesses from your own experience, or maybe you've seen some of the research before on LGBTQ donors, but what might you know about this donor population? So I'll just give us a chance to think about that for a minute. Either what do you know or what do you think you know about LGBTQ donors? Let's see if anyone's brave enough to chat that out. I don't see anything, so maybe you have that in the back of your head. But let's see how the research actually pans out. So, like donors generally, LGBTQ people give to the widest variety of charitable causes that there is. But they also show some interesting patterns that do diverge from sort of general population donor behavior. So first, we know that LGBTQ donors give to advocacy and civil rights organizations at a much, much higher rate than the general US population. One early study actually found that LGBTQ donors gave about 25% of their total philanthropy to LGBTQ advocacy organizations and 13% of their contributions to non-LGBTQ advocacy organizations. And this is vastly different from the about 2% of the population that would support an advocacy or civil rights organization in a given year. So much higher support here. And of course, this area of the nonprofit subsector for those students in the room includes both LGBTQ organizations as well as kind of more general organizations like ACLU who work on a wide number of causes. Second, we know that LGBTQ donors are less likely to give to religious organizations. This probably isn't very surprising to you. But the religious subsector in the US still receives the largest share of individual giving. And about 2/3 of all households actually give to religious organizations. But LGBTQ donors are about half as likely to support these organizations. However, it's important to note that for some LGBTQ donors, religion is a huge factor in terms of motivating their philanthropy. So again, this is the variation that we see within the community. This is likely due to the number of organizations that might serve HIV positive, and they're as much as 4 times as likely to support organizations in the arts. So just some kind of broad patterns here in giving. So one research study that I conducted was with a number of couples in the state of Indiana. I interviewed 19 same-sex couples, so about 38 people. And we looked at all of their giving from the past year. And one of the things that I always like to share is that most people assume that the majority of LGBTQ philanthropy actually goes to support LGBTQ focused organizations. And that's just not true. So this is a percentage in terms of number of gifts, so not dollar amount, but where an individual gift was. And you can see already couples in human services, society benefit, arts and culture, and education. And almost 80% of couples also supported an LGBTQ organization, but again, only about 15% of the total number of gifts went to those LGBTQ organizations. So here, even in a small interview study that is not generalizable, we see some of the same kind of patterns that were repeated from earlier. So I'm curious for those of you in the audience, if you have experience with LGBTQ donors, how does this compare? Maybe you can drop that in the chat. How does this compare to either alumni donors or other donors in terms of the interests and priorities that they have? Now, a couple of years ago, the US Trust Bank of America study on high net worth philanthropy actually added a question about sexual orientation to their demographics. And so beginning in 2016 and then again in 2018, we've started to get some data on high net worth donors. So these are donors who either have a net worth of $1 million, excluding the value of their home, or an income of at least $200,000 a year. So as a result, researchers were able to compare the differences between giving practices of high net worth LGBTQ and non-LGBTQ individuals. So on average, we saw that LGBTQ people gave to more organizations, that again, they were more likely to support arts and culture, as well as environment and animals and international issues, which were subsectors we hadn't seen before among the general population. They were also more planful about their giving. They were more likely to say that they had a budget for their philanthropy. And this was about 57% versus 48% in the general population. And we also saw this kind of unique parallel that in addition to giving charitably, that they were more likely to have made a political contribution to a candidate or campaign. And going back to 2016, this was actually data from the prior year. So this was both under the Obama and Trump presidencies. And they were almost about 10% more likely to have supported a political candidate. So the LGBTQ Giving Project that I mentioned earlier, they conducted a lot of surveys following the 2016 presidential election, and they compared a known group of donors to LGBTQ specific organizations to the broader LGBTQ population. And they found that LGBTQ donors were more likely to have engaged in a broad range of civic and political and philanthropic activities following the election. So this included everything from attending rallies and volunteering with nonprofits, as well as contacting their elected officials. So we know that there's this kind of interesting intersection of civic engagement and charitable engagement that often overlaps with LGBTQ donors. And we sort of, our working thesis that LGBTQ donors have a heightened awareness of both political needs, and so therefore kind of view philanthropy as one tool to create social change. And certainly seeing the gains in things like marriage equality, other legal protections has certainly bolstered that support. It's made it something very tangible to many people in this community. We also have done some research specifically around plan giving, and the LGBTQ Giving Project also did plan giving specific research. And we know that there's sort of this exceptional opportunity among LGBTQ individuals to make plan gifts, both for the transfer of wealth that's coming in the baby boomer population or generation, and the fact that older LGBTQ Americans are much less likely to have children. And so there aren't sort of natural, there isn't a natural next generation to sort of inherit, whatever people have accumulated, whether that's, something relatively modest or something kind of much more that wealthy. So we know that about 16% of LGBTQ donors have actually committed a gift to an LGBTQ organization that came out of this giving project, but another 35% actually said that they would consider it, which is a huge percentage in terms of the openness to making plan gifts. And this compares to sort of the general population, where estimates are that only about 5% of people make plan gifts in the US. So we see this much higher likelihood. And then in some research that I've done that compared LGBTQ planned gift donors with sort of the broader population, we also see that these donors are on average writing their wills a couple years earlier and establishing their first plan gift at an average age of 50, so about 3 years earlier than the general population. So these intentions are really quite different among the LGBTQ community. And we really think that there's sort of this moment, maybe a 10 to 20 year period where we're going to see a higher number of LGBTQ households without children to sort of take advantage of this giving opportunity. All right, so we're going to move on to LGBTQ donor motivations. And like I said earlier, this is, I think, one of the most kind of fascinating parts of all philanthropic research. And you might just take a moment. I'll stop talking so that you can think about this question. But why do you give? If you've made a charitable gift recently, just think about what motivated that gift. And you can see kind of where you fall in these different motivations. All right, hopefully we all have that in mind. So first I'll start a little bit talking about specific motivations in the LGBTQ community. And this again came out of the research that I did with LGBTQ couples or same-sex couples, but also draws on research from other academics as well. So I've already mentioned this, but supporting the LGBTQ community and sort of this connection between shaping public policy and legal protections is often a motivating factor in philanthropy. So these are sort of the advocacy and the civil rights organizations that we talked about earlier. And what I found is that many donors are sort of very much aware of this connection and use this explanation in their giving in terms of why they've made certain gift decisions. However, the study also found that LGBTQ people were much more motivated to give sort of once they had achieved a point of stability in their life, not just financial stability, but sort of comfort and acceptance of their sexual orientation or other aspects of their identity. So once they were secure in their identities, they might actually look to give back in some way. So this could be supporting LGBTQ youth, maybe identifying as part of the LGBT community and wanting to support other organizations in that community and create sort of the sense of belonging. And we've also seen in some more recent research that this isn't just limited to supporting LGBTQ organizations. We've seen that actually that people who've experienced discrimination often are more inclined to support other marginalized communities as well. So there's this heightened sense of identity that is actually, we think, carrying over into organizations like Black Lives Matter, supporting organizations like immigrant rights. So we see some inclinations to support others that are actually higher than people who haven't experienced discrimination. A lot of the men in my study and a few of the women as well also talked about the experience of coming of age in the HIV/AIDS kind of era in the 1980s and 1990s. And this was often a significant time for many people because of the loss that they experienced. And so for that reason, many of these individuals have continued to support these organizations, often through kind of social fundraising, things like walks, dining out for life, and make this kind of an annual part of their giving. It wasn't necessarily a huge part of their giving, but it was a part of their participation. However, there were 2 participants in my study who identified as HIV positive, and for them, supporting these organizations were really crucial. They were, very active as volunteers and as well as donors, and found both support and pride in helping one another. The last 2 motivations here that I'll talk about are a little bit different because they apply more to supporting all sorts of nonprofit organizations, not just LGBTQ focused organizations. First, there's this idea that it's important to assert LGBTQ identity in mainstream organizations. This came up with several couples that I interviewed who talked about the fact that they were motivated by the fact that they could be seen as a gay couple or a same-sex couple supporting a mainstream organization, whether it be arts organization or the zoo or an alma mater, an academic institution. And so this is really the area where LGBTQ identity goes beyond those LGBTQ organizations and has a lot more implications for the broader nonprofit sector in terms of recognizing LGBTQ donors. The story that I always love to tell here is there's one couple who were quite active with one of their alma mater universities. And they actually made a gift of about $50,000 to replace the presidential chain, which is worn at commencement. This is like a very ornate like gold chain that's part of the academic regalia. But in doing that, they somehow negotiated that they would be acknowledged in the commencement program for a number of years. And they just thought it was so important for graduating students and those parents and friends to know that there is this same-sex couple that was giving to support the university. And that story has always stuck with me. The other aspect of identity that we saw come up in the donor motivations is about organizations that donors wouldn't support. So LGBTQ people are often seeking acceptance. They want to be validated for who they are. And so there's a sort of judgment call that they're making about whether an organization is actually supportive of the community or not. And so this often came up with organizations that had either patterns or practices of discrimination. Specific organizations that would come up a lot in conversation were organizations like the Boy Scouts, even the Salvation Army. Even though those organizations have kind of matured on their policies, there's sort of a sting that has been long lasting. And so we see this as also important, that you might need to sort of come out with a public kind of statement, whether it's your non-discrimination statement or other forms of kind of social recognition, to say that we are supportive of the LGBTQ community. So although there were these aspects of giving that were influenced by participants' sexual orientation, in many ways, this is where LGBTQ donors are just like everyone else. We all give. So if you think back to my question of why did you make your most recent gift? We all give for reasons around personal connections and experiences, and just being parts of organizations. Maybe you support the organization, the nonprofit that you work for or volunteer with. So these are much more common motivations in the philanthropic research, and probably motivations that are familiar to you. A few others that were really frequently mentioned is the belief in organizational effectiveness. So donors were often saying, we support this organization because we believe in the leader, we believe that they do good work. This has been consistent in the literature. And while the costs and benefits to donating have been studied extensively as a motivation, tax benefits and donor recognition mattered less to participants overall. So these aren't sort of the number one reasons why they're giving, but donors often said they were nice to have, and certainly maybe made them give a little bit more or time their gift a little bit differently. Again, for those individuals who had a strong spiritual practice, religiosity might have been a motivating factor. Again, it didn't show up for everybody, but it was for those who were kind of actively practicing, actively attending a religious community, often a guiding factor. And then finally, this sort of catch-all at the end, this idea of giving back, experiencing joy while giving, sometimes alleviating guilt, were also motivations. And so each motivation here that has a star after it is one that actually has in some way a connection to LGBTQ identity, as well as maybe other connections as well. So, and then some of these, of course, are common across all donors. I talked a little bit about barriers to giving in terms of discrimination, but there were other barriers to giving as well. These could be a negative perception of the organization, over solicitation. So we're aware that donors might get turned off if they're asked too frequently or not thanked enough in between being asked. Certainly there was, because this was a cross-section of couples, there were some people who just said, I'm interested in this, but I don't know this issue or this cause, but I don't know any organizations, and they hadn't done that research. And then sometimes a barrier to giving would be sort of this failure in stewardship, whether it be a lack of recognition or recognition errors, particularly around salutations, letters, and sending mail, which I'll talk about a little bit at the end. Going back to the LGBTQ Giving Project here for a moment, they did some interesting analysis of donor motivations by generation. And they found that younger donors in particular, now this is all giving to LGBTQ specific organizations, but younger donors were much more focused on serving youth, helping future generations, and were very cognizant of the diversity of staff and leadership in the organization, as well as the importance of focusing on trans justice. So different motivations for younger donors as compared to older donors who are much more focused on policy change and ending discrimination. And so we can see some of these kind of interesting generational differences as well. And in my conversations with fundraisers, we see some sort of differences even with their work with donors, that maybe younger alumni would be more inclined to support things like emergency funds for students, whereas older alumni might really be looking for leadership, kind of the importance of representation, and maybe looking much more at the institutional level. So the last piece of sort of new information, hopefully, that I'll share with you is a little bit about financial management and charitable decision making. So this also came out of my research. In addition to, talking with donors about why they give and what motivated their philanthropy, I asked questions around how they managed money. And I thought this was important because I expected that LGBTQ people and same-sex couples in particular might choose some different forms of financial management than opposite-sex couples. So even though we've had lots of social changes and people are marrying later, women are having careers before they get married, it's still the dominant practice in opposite-sex couples to jointly pool household financial resources, especially within, if not initially at marriage, within a few years following marriage. So the interesting piece here is that when I interviewed same-sex couples, we saw much more individual control over resources. So I had 8 out of 19 couples who had completely separate financial management. So independent control over, each, source of income that people brought into the relationship. 6 couples engaged in what's called partial pooling. So this is actually where they might have a joint household account, and then each person also has individual accounts. And only 5 out of the 19 couples actually combined all their resources. And it was interesting for the couples that jointly combined their resources. It was often because either one person made a lot more money than the other, or one person wasn't working, maybe staying home and taking care of children. And so jointly pooling money in those circumstances actually was a form, kind of a greater form of equity, because it gave both people equal access to the funds. So while these arrangements signal important differences in both power and conflict over money, this does matter for philanthropy, because depending on how you manage your money, there can be different places from which you give, and whether or not you have that jointly pooled funds or your own accounts and funds, whether they be more discretionary or, if you're only combining the absolute essentials for the household, there's more places from which charitable giving can be initiated, either from one individual or the couple. And the other piece that was really interesting here in the interviews is that often we saw that wherever the money came from didn't necessarily match the recognition. So For example, I could make a gift to an organization, but put both me and my wife's name on it. Now that might also happen from a joint account, but it could also happen from just one of us. So this was just an interesting kind of paradox, and it made me, think as a researcher, do fundraisers really know, who's making the gift decision and how they would like to be recognized, and that those two things might not necessarily be the same. The other thing that was really important here is that even among couples, the 5 couples that only had the joint accounts, we would often expect to see some bargaining, that there's one person in the couple who's much more inclined to be charitable or to spend money, and another person that's sort of the brakes. So we think of that as gas pedal and the brakes. But when it came to charitable giving, most couples, at least in their interviews with me, said, this wasn't something that charitable giving was not a source of conflict for them. They were generally supportive of one another's interests and organizations. And maybe there's a little bit discussion of, how much, and one person wanted to give more than the other. But, those points of conflict were resolved fairly quickly. Even when these couples said, if we weren't together, I wouldn't necessarily be supporting that organization. So the real big takeaway here is that there's actually, among same-sex couples, potentially more opportunities for charitable giving, as gifts could come from either individual in the couple or the couple as a whole. And just because I am both a qualitative and quantitative researcher, I wanted to share a couple quotes that came out of interviews that I've conducted. So I'll just give you a moment here to read Kathy and John's words about deciding with their spouse how to give. All right, so I'm sure you want to know, what do I do with all of this information? I've learned about some different giving patterns. I've learned about different giving motivations. How are we going to identify and engage LGBTQ donors and supporters, regardless of the mission of your organization? So I want to start by just talking for a minute here around specifically giving to higher education. So I know that many of you are from Illinois and maybe affiliated with NIU or another university, but university communities are quite large. And so, having LGBTQ constituencies of kind of a sizable number is somewhat expected. And so there's been a lot of interest, particularly from higher ed fundraisers, around developing LGBTQ donor communities. First, it's really important, whether you're in higher ed or in another organization, to think about kind of your data infrastructure and the foundation for that. And whether or not you're actually able to identify LGBTQ individuals in order to maybe cultivate these donors with that identity in mind. So for higher ed in particular, it can be really important to have some sort of tagging mechanism in student and alumni databases that create an affiliation with on-campus activities and memberships that are LGBTQ related. And I know Molly will have more to say about this in a few minutes. At the same time, we also need to recognize and respect sensitivities around sort of this identification. So while, joining the Pride organization or participating in events that are put on by a Center for Gender and Sexuality are important, maybe not all individuals are either out or want to be associated in that fashion. So there's often for current students a need to sort of have the option to identify, but also have the option not to. That being said, we've tracked athletics and debate teams and um, Greek affiliations with our students and alumni for years, and continue to use those points of kind of identity and experience as a way to steward alumni. And so without having an option to identify alumni who've been particularly active in these organizations, we're really missing out on this opportunity. And we can also just ask people, like, how do you identify? Would you like to identify in this way? So without that data, it can be really difficult to understand where to begin, or even, the size of your LGBTQ kind of constituency. So negotiating those decisions becomes really important. Second, it's really important to start activating networks of leadership, of prominent LGBTQ alumni who can help kind of reach out to others. So this might come from kind of leadership and founders of LGBTQ centers and programs on campus, could come from kind of allied academic programs. And it's really about building these connections. So for some of you, you might not be aware that Spelman University in Atlanta, Georgia, is actually in the process of establishing the first endowed chair in queer studies. And that's been a gift that actually came from, it was seeded by John Stryker, who is not a member of the LGBTQ community, but is a supporter. And then they're using that as sort of a matching gift to identify other potential donors. You also need to have the commitment of leadership. Your fundraising will not be successful if that environment isn't shared by the university leadership. This is something that I'll say from a Catholic Jesuit institution where I'm at, has been something of an impediment to some LGBTQ fundraising, because we're sort of held back in some ways by policies of the Catholic Church. And so even though we might, as a university, be out in front in certain ways, I would say that our students are often leading our executives and our leaders. And then finally, just the importance of representation and authentic engagement. A lot of universities I've seen have really started with kind of some LGBTQ affiliated alumni events, really just kind of building a community, sometimes needing to do some repair depending on what that on-campus environment was like. But building up that community, finding points of connection, and then from there identifying people who are inclined to give. So this might, like I said, come through the partnership of an alumni association, but it could also, come through individual donors. It looks a little bit different at every university. Indiana University, for example, launched their queer philanthropy circle a couple years ago. They also have a Black philanthropy circle and a women's philanthropy circle. And so that's been one way that they've been developing their engagement. And I'm happy to talk more about some practices that different universities are doing. But bottom line is, sort of wherever you are, it's important to start now, and to start in the ways that make sense to take those kind of natural next steps. So I'm curious, if you've done work with LGBTQ donors, what's worked well within your organizations or your institutions, or what hasn't worked well? Maybe there's something that you might want to share, sort of like a lesson learned. And then I'm always curious about what I shared today, how you might put that into practice, or what your natural kind of next steps would be. So I'm going to pause for a few minutes. I do have kind of one last wrap-up slide to share, but I'd love to open it up for discussion and questions, and then leave you with a little bit of food for thought.
Yeah, we have a lot of questions in the chat, Elizabeth, so we're going to have some good discussions.
So let's bring up the chat here. Alicia, is there a question that sort of jumped out to you just because I'm kind of looking at this?
I'll distill a couple. So some of the research that you referred to, is that your research, specifically the stuff that you were doing in Indiana, or is that represent research more broadly and the researchers that are working on kind of the bigger questions that you talked about?
Yeah, so the Indiana same-sex couple study is my own study. That's what my dissertation was on. I've done some plan giving research that also involved in what we call an oversample of LGBTQ donors. And then so there's sort of some analogous research out there that's starting to get published around kind of giving in higher ed. There's just a study done on LGB donors, so it didn't involve the T or the Q, to Hurricane, I think Irma. I might be forgetting which hurricane, but it was that basically showed the higher empathy, and the link between discrimination and charitable giving, even to non-LGBTQ people. So it's starting to be more than just me and a couple friends, but it's still really just me and a couple friends that have done a lot of this work.
Nice. Another question around how much do we know, and maybe we don't know a lot yet because the research is still relatively new, is the interaction of LGBTQ and race, and how those two, how that kind of comes together in the research, or we don't know enough yet to kind of make those any assumptions. Yeah,
I think so. One of the challenges to all sorts of charitable giving research is having enough of different kind of identity-based communities to make kind of conclusive and accurate comparisons. And so one of the reasons we haven't been able to look at sort of multiple identity categories together is just not having enough people in these surveys who identify as, for example, both a person of color and LGBTQ. So this is definitely an area I think that we're looking at. I have some ideas of new research projects that sort of get at multiple identity issues. I mean, we know theoretically that our identities are not, fixed, that we all inhabit kind of these multiple categories. But I think, even as people, to know consciously how those all kind of interact is difficult. And so it's just going to take us more time to kind of understand the nuance and more kind of research, more people doing this research to ask these different questions.
So one of the motivations to have Elizabeth come and speak to all of you was also a little bit of a selfish motivation, because I think NIU, just like many of the universities, is trying to figure this out. How do we cultivate those relationships with all individuals, and how do we segment accordingly? So I don't know, Molly, if you want to introduce yourself and the center that you run and kind of where you're at in your fundraising and some questions that you might want to kick us off for Elizabeth too.
Sure, thank you. I'm Molly Holmes. I'm the director of Northern Illinois University's Gender and Sexuality Resource Center, which, for those who aren't familiar, we are situated under academic affairs, but support students' persistence and retention as part of academic equity, diversity, and inclusion at NIU. So I think that I can share a little bit about some of our efforts in working with our alumni association. But I would very much say that we're still sort of like getting started and figuring out what makes the most sense in terms of, engaging alums and other donors to our efforts. And I think that also we really are cognizant about that piece of the research about potentially alumni wanting to give to like our center or an event that we might do, rather than thinking more about, the university broadly. So in those ways, we've tried to just get started with some alumni engaging events. I try to be a little bit better about communication updates. We launched our first virtual social for around homecoming with LGBTQ donors and friends. And so that's kind of where we're getting started. But I think everyone on the call are interested in kind of rolling up and amping up our efforts in ways that make sense with our institutional profile. So that's, I think, where I'll start as where we're at.
So I've been also kind of watching the chat and seeing if there's some other kind of questions that bubble up. I know there's a number of different fundraising individuals, both from our NIU Foundation, as well as many nonprofit organizations. Any questions that you might have to Elizabeth of how you can use some of this information today? Like, what are things that you can take some actions on today that starts to move your organization or your fundraising and development office towards more inclusivity? Any kind of thoughts from our fundraising folks that I know are on the call? I know that someone who I know is going to attend today, they reached out to me and said, well, we're in the middle of a large campaign, and we know that we've had real strong interest to develop one of these programs that will really support the LGBTQ community. Should we make assumptions around who will likely to support that? I think that's a challenge, and that was something, I don't know if you wanted to comment on that, but that's a real concern that they have, is how do we segment with being appropriately sensitive to who we target, when we're trying to identify these programs and donors?
That's a great question. And in my conversations with fundraisers, and I will say I interviewed about 8 different fundraisers back in the fall who are all kind of doing something related to LGBTQ giving on their campuses. Some are saying that, almost half of the supporters to sort of LGBTQ initiatives did not identify as LGBTQ. So, this is certainly, like I said, way back in the beginning, this is a community that's, much more kind of visible, that we know kind of a lot more about, that we're talking about. And so we're seeing both kind of this mix of straight as well as LGBTQ support for different initiatives. So I think the question is more about, like, what is the initiative? What is the purpose? Is it to support students? Like there's something called the Lavender Fund at Howard University that was actually started by an alum, which is a scholarship fund. Is it something like that? Is it something like at the University of Michigan, they're looking to actually create an endowment around the Spectrum Center, which is, I believe, the oldest LGBTQ center in the country. So it can look very different. And if there's sort of an LGBTQ specific funding opportunity, it also doesn't have to be limited to LGBTQ donors. And you might actually want, like, I'm thinking like in a campaign situation, you might actually want some leadership volunteers who represent different communities. So those are just a couple kind of examples that come to top of mind.
You mentioned a couple things around donor motivations and having some trust in these organizations, that when things are on their website or things are in the materials that make them feel heard, or that make, so it's, and there's a lot of reasons why we want to do that for all populations, but is there anything there you can help us with, like organizations even that you can think of that might be doing a better job than others who are a little bit more overtly welcoming?
I wish I had some good examples to share. Let me think for a moment.
They're so rare. Is that why?
You know, I think it's either that we're not, I mean, certainly, you know, it's hard to pay attention to like the wide range of, you know, alumni magazines and, you know, who are you featuring as part of your donors? And even just like knowing, you know, so few surveys have asked questions like I'm thinking about nonprofit boards, like how many nonprofit board surveys have asked about members' sexual orientation or gender identity? And that's much more recent. So we just don't have sort of the broad data. I think, you know, the opportunity is really to show kind of the diverse support of your community. Some of the kind of university specific initiatives that I mentioned, like Howard's Lavender Fund, or, you know, this endowed chair in queer studies, you know, those are sort of much more visible kind of initiatives at the university level where people can sort of sign on and be supportive of those efforts. And so it does make a difference if the president attends that event or if other key leaders are there. And especially if, you know, kind of working from sort of those who are most closely connected to you kind of outward, you know, if someone's bringing along some friends who maybe they knew when they were in college and, you know, they all happen to share an LGBTQ identity, you know, they might not have all had the same experience. And so having sort of those initial interactions that show like things have changed and that, you know, administration and leadership are on board with some of these efforts becomes really important. And then I think, you know, for those in communications positions, you know, for people thinking about like kind of the marketing side of it, just thinking about the diversity of donor stories that you're sharing and you know, when you identify a gap, to try to find other alums, other donors to share those stories that might incorporate that aspect of their identity. I mean, you don't want to force it. It's not you know, again, it's not the only part of people's identity, but kind of having that broad representation.
No, I think those are all good suggestions. The Association of Fundraising Professionals, many of our professional fundraisers might belong to that group. What are they doing as an association to represent fundraisers, to kind of give fundraisers the tools, the language, the training? Have you seen anything there, or where can fundraisers go? I mean, we do a lot at the university level, but I'm thinking of all the nonprofits out there that have very small staffs. Where do they go for some of the professional development on those kinds of things? Do you know?
Well, I'm going to share a few tips here at the end.
Okay. You can do that now. Wait, that's fine. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, and you know, I think local AFP chapters are great. I know some have been kind of, you know, I've spoken to chapters, and larger chapters might have some more resources. But I think, you know, having those conversations with other fundraisers, talking through either challenges or concerns or how to handle objections, like those are all good practices. And I think this is, and then we also, you know, I'm also meeting more and more LGBTQ identified fundraisers. So you might have people on your staff who can either take some leadership or who might have a perspective to offer. So let me share my tips, and then we can come back to more questions. Because
that sounds great.
Maybe this will allow us to have a little bit more to talk about. Okay, implications for fundraisers. So these are sort of my takeaways from all of this different research, and, you know, both my own and others, as places to start. So first, making sure that sexual orientation and gender identity are included in non-discrimination policies. So these are because, you know, even the perception of discrimination was enough to turn some potential donors away from supporting an organization. You know, I know that these often exist for universities and colleges, but for smaller organizations, there might not be a diversity and inclusion statement on the website. And I think this can be a great kind of place to start to signal like, this is important to us and we care. Second, really thinking about active outreach to the LGBTQ community. So this is true for LGBTQ people as well as many other marginalized communities who are kind of receiving heightened attention now as we're thinking about donor diversity. But you need to cultivate authentic relationships with LGBTQ constituents and signal that you welcome their involvement and participation. And sometimes this could include LGBTQ specific programming, maybe doing something around Gay Pride Month in June, or aligning your organization with larger efforts either for LGBTQ equality or in opposition to some kind of discriminatory bill that might be happening in your particular state or at the federal level. So this could also look like highlighting the efforts of LGBTQ donors and volunteers in newsletters and other publications, kind of building this visibility. Then I really recommend kind of looking at that data foundation for the future and having those conversations if you haven't already. Those can often take some time to kind of sort through. I know databases kind of, my perspective is that databases reinforce the patterns that we already have. So if you are already predominantly kind of white, straight donors, then your database, unless you do something different, is going to sort of elevate that community automatically. And so you have to do something to kind of interrupt that process. Next, for donors that are in same-sex relationships, talking about if and how they want their partner involved can also be sort of a way to deepen that relationship, to understand more about, is this a shared priority? Is this really just one person's priority? How do they want to be recognized? Are you getting their names and salutations correct? Those kinds of direct conversations can actually really build trust with an organization. We've talked a little bit already about acknowledgement and recognition processes for same-sex couples and particularly transgender individuals. This, an error here, especially one that's repeated many times, can make it pretty difficult to salvage a relationship. So maybe having easy ways to either have people update their information, or if you are aware of a donor that maybe has had this happen to them in the past, that you kind of put an extra set of eyes on that and make sure that the acknowledgement is corrected in the future. I shared a lot of information about plan giving today. Really making that a part of the conversation with LGBTQ donors. Frankly, I think it should be a part of almost all donor conversations because there's such a great opportunity for plan giving, and it's something that individuals of all different kind of wealth can do, but especially our LGBTQ community. Finding institutional experts and asking for guidance. So for example, Molly would be a great resource on the NIU campus to, have conversations with or guide some of these perhaps changes or developments within the fundraising program. So whether that comes from staff, whether it comes from constituents, alumni, finding interested people with kind of direct experience and engaging them and asking for their opinion and, how does this sound? That's important. You're developing that relationship at the same time you're using that lived experience to guide your practice. And then, just a reminder that at the end of the day, we want donors of all varieties want to see results. They want to see that their gift was put to good use. They want to know that the organization is effective. So just continuing to not forget that these also matter and that we need to communicate this effectiveness. And then I'll just put this up for a moment. I'm happy to go back to the other slide on implications, but I have some kind of shorter links here if you would like to read more about my research or the LGBTQ Giving Project. The resource here at the Haas Jr. Website, there's a nice report there. And again, that's really geared toward LGBTQ organizations, but has some kind of broader implications as well. And then feel free to email me if there's something else that you're looking for, or if you have a great idea for some research that we haven't done yet. This is kind of an ongoing process and something that I'm committed to continuing to develop, and also welcome other interested people to help with this. So I hope between those implications and our additional resources, you've been able to take something away from the presentation today.
And I did pop Elizabeth's website in there into the main chat so that you can go find her, and all of her research is there and all of the links that she has there. Any other final questions or thoughts from anyone? If you do, you can pop those in the chat, but I really want to thank Elizabeth for sharing her expertise and her research with us. You know, Molly was instrumental. We were chatting to kind of set this up and bring a presentation like this to NIU. The Center for Nonprofit and NGO Studies and we have been doing more of these kinds of sessions, looking at philanthropy broadly or community engagement broadly. So I appreciate your support of our programs and hope that you can come to a future one as well. So I'm going to stop